Welcome to Arsenal, where the weapons and war machines of military history come to life. Today, we explore the Lexington-class aircraft carriers in the Pacific during the early years of the Second World War, and the sailors, aviators, and opponents who gave them their reputation. A longer print edition of this story, with fact sheets and photos, is available on LinkedIn or by email. Arsenal is the Friday feature of Dispatch, U.S. Military History magazine, developed by trackpads.com. Dawn over the Coral Sea rises gray and low, with sky and water blurred into one horizon. On the flight deck of USS Lexington, men in colored jerseys hurry between parked aircraft, while turbines thunder and propellers scream. The big carrier turns into the wind, her bow cutting a white V through the Pacific as the air over the deck climbs toward launch speed.
An SBD Dauntless claws into the air, then another. TBD Devastator torpedo planes follow, each taking a short, shuddering run before dropping off the bow and lifting away. Below, aircraft handlers wrestle spare planes into position, fueling and arming them, while radios crackle and plotting boards fill with grease pencil tracks. The ship hums with compressed energy, waiting for word that the Japanese carriers have been found.
Hours later, the pressure breaks into violence. Lookouts call incoming raids, and the gray sky fills with specks that grow into dive bombers and torpedo planes. Lexington heels into hard turns. Bombs slam into the sea nearby, throwing columns of water over the deck. Then torpedoes hit, shock moving through steel and bone alike. Fires bloom, smoke spreads, and the crew fights to keep the floating airfield alive. When Lexington's men finally abandon ship into an oil-streaked sea, they are leaving more than one hull behind. They have been fighting inside a new kind of naval warfare, one where opposing fleets may never see each other. Aircraft carry the battle beyond the horizon, and the big, fast carrier becomes the base that makes those long-range blows possible. The loss is painful, but the concept has been proven. The Lexington class began as an answer to a different problem. After the First World War, the U.S. Navy worried about fast enemy raiders and battlecruisers threatening sea lanes and the battleship line. Lexington and Saratoga were first laid down as battlecruisers, intended to be swift, heavily armed scouts and flankers. Then arms limitation treaties imposed tonnage caps, and naval aviation began to challenge assumptions about how the next war at sea would be fought. Aircraft were the disruptive force. Experiments showed they could find ships beyond the horizon and deliver bombs and torpedoes at distances no gun could reach. The issue was not simply putting airplanes on ships. Early carriers had already tested that. The real challenge was building a fast, long-legged floating airfield that could keep up with the fleet, carry a large air group, and strike first across the vast Pacific.
Existing carriers such as Langley were useful test beds, but too slow and limited to anchor a war plan. Navy planners began to see carriers as more than scouts. Given enough speed, endurance, and aircraft, they could become the main striking arm. Converting the unfinished Lexington and Saratoga offered a way to preserve valuable hulls, stay within treaty rules, and test whether carrier airpower could truly lead fleet engagements.
That conversion decision captured the uncertainty of the interwar Navy. Battleships still carried prestige, but aircraft were already forcing officers to think in terms of scouting radius, deck cycles, and strike range. The Lexington hulls were too valuable to waste and too constrained by treaty to finish as originally planned. By rebuilding them as carriers, the Navy accepted a practical experiment. Take the speed and size of a battlecruiser and see whether aviation could make better use of it than heavy guns. Turning battlecruisers into carriers was not a simple change of labels. Naval architects had to reshape hulls designed for big guns and armor into ships built around flight operations. They stripped away planned heavy turrets and much of the armor,
then added long flight decks, hangar spaces, aviation fuel systems, magazines, elevators, and workshops. Every decision raised questions about balance, strength, fire risk, and how much weight could be carried high above the waterline. The battlecruiser hulls offered speed and range, but the large machinery and remaining structure limited what could be added above. Stability became a constant concern once the flight deck and island were installed. Designers kept 8-inch guns for a time as a hedge against surface action, but those weapons took space and weight that could have supported more aircraft equipment or anti-aircraft defenses. The ships were compromises between the battleship world that created them and the carrier world they were entering.
From the Navy's perspective, the payoff was worth it. The Lexington-class emerged as fast fleet carriers, able to steam at well over 30 knots and keep pace with cruisers and destroyers. Their turbo-electric drive gave smooth power control and long endurance, though it was complex to maintain. Each ship displaced roughly 40,000 tons at full load, stretched more than 800 feet, carried several thousand crewmen, and operated about 70 to 90 aircraft, depending on the period and air group mix.
The ships also carried the habits of their earlier design life. They were large, fast, and powerful, but not optimized in every detail for the kind of carrier war that would come later. Some arrangements made sense when surface action still seemed possible. Others would look less efficient once aircraft became the central weapon. That tension made the Lexington-class especially valuable as a learning platform. Seen from the sea, a Lexington-class carrier looked like a long, high-sided island of steel moving at improbable speed. The flight deck ran almost to the horizon, with the island on the starboard side holding bridges, masts, funnels, navigation spaces, wheels, boots, chocks, and tie-down chains. Below that deck was the hangar, the real heart of the carrier. Aircraft were parked, repaired, armed, and moved by cranes, crews, and elevators. Aviation fuel lines, bomb and torpedo magazines, and ammunition hoists fed the whole system. Their protection became a matter of life and death in combat, because a hit in the wrong place could turn the ship's aviation capability into fire, fumes, and explosions. The carrier's elevators made the whole system work. They connected the hangar's hidden labor to the exposed flight deck above, lifting aircraft into launch order and sending damaged or serviced planes below. Every elevator movement affected the next launch or recovery cycle. If a plane blocked the wrong space, if a fueling detail fell behind, or if ordnance arrived late, the rhythm of the ship slowed. Carrier warfare depended on machinery, but it also depended on choreography. Crew life revolved around this flying factory. Flight deck teams moved aircraft, loaded weapons, fueled tanks, and signaled pilots. Colored jerseys marked roles so the deck could be read at a glance. Pilots and aircrew waited in ready rooms, studying diagrams and maps before climbing into their aircraft. Below, in crowded berthing and squadron spaces, men tried to sleep between launches while the ship vibrated around them. Deep in the hull, engineers and machinists tended the boilers and turbo-electric machinery that drove the carriers through the water. Their world was heat, noise, gauges, valves, and the knowledge that lost speed could mean danger. Elsewhere, radar operators, lookouts, and plotting teams built a picture of the surrounding battle. Early radar and fighter direction procedures were still developing when war came, but they helped turn the carrier into both a sensor platform and a striking arm. Flight operations were dangerous even before enemy aircraft arrived. Engines, spinning propellers, fuel hoses, bombs, torpedoes, slick decks, and moving aircraft all shared the same crowded space. The colored jerseys and repeated drills were not decoration, they were survival tools. A carrier that could not control its own deck could not project power across the ocean. When war reached the Pacific in late 1941, the Lexington-class carriers moved from exercises into combat. Lexington was at sea during the attack on Pearl Harbor and avoided damage, then began raids and covering missions across the Central and South Pacific. In May 1942, she entered the Coral Sea with Yorktown to stop a Japanese thrust toward Port Moresby and the sea lanes to Australia.
The battle also forced commanders to trust information that was incomplete, delayed, or wrong. Search aircraft might report a contact that proved to be the wrong group of ships. Strike leaders had to decide how far to fly over empty ocean with fuel running down. Back on the carrier, officers plotted reports and guesses on boards while deciding whether to launch, recover, turn, or wait. This uncertainty became a defining feature of carrier warfare. At Coral Sea, the opposing fleets fought with aircraft across hundreds of miles of ocean. For the first time, carrier task forces on both sides launched large, coordinated strikes at enemies they could not see from their own decks. Lexington's air group helped locate and attack Japanese carriers and support ships, while her fighters climbed to meet incoming raids, and her gunners filled the sky with anti-aircraft fire.
The battle showed that launching, recovering, refueling, and rearming aircraft under pressure could be more decisive than any gun broadside. It also showed the price. Bomb and torpedo hits damaged Lexington's hull, fuel systems, and electrical networks. Fires spread through spaces filled with aviation fuel vapors and munitions. Damage control crews fought for hours, but eventually the fires became uncontrollable. The order came to abandon ship, and friendly torpedoes later finished her to prevent capture. Lexington's loss also became a damage control lesson. The crew had fought fires, flooding, and smoke with determination, but aviation fuel vapors and damaged systems created hazards that were hard to predict and harder to contain. Later carriers benefited from these lessons in how fuel systems were protected, how firefighting was organized, and how crews trained for cascading failures below decks. The ship was lost, but the experience was not wasted.
Coral Sea was not a clean victory, but it halted the Japanese advance and proved that carrier task forces could blunt a major offensive. Saratoga's wartime path was different, but equally instructive. Torpedoed early in 1942 and forced into repairs, she returned to support the Guadalcanal campaign, then later served as a reinforcement carrier, training carrier, and test platform for new aircraft and tactics. Together, Lexington and Saratoga gave the Navy its first hard education in large-deck carrier warfare.
Their strengths were clear. They were big, fast ships with the range and capacity to carry a heavy striking force across the ocean. Their speed helped them choose when to engage or withdraw. Their large hangars, workshops, stores, and flight decks supported sustained operations and gave pilots more room for takeoffs and landings. As anti-aircraft batteries improved, the ships could combine fighters, radar direction, and guns into layered defenses. Their weaknesses were just as real. Their size made them obvious targets, and their conversion origins left them without the armored flight decks found in some later carriers. Large spaces devoted to aviation fuel and munitions made fire and explosion a constant danger if bombs or torpedoes breached protective systems. Lexington's loss showed how fast fuel vapors and damaged electrical systems could turn internal damage into catastrophe. Saratoga's repeated torpedo damage showed the limits of underwater protection. Japanese pilots understood the value of these ships and treated them as high-priority targets. Sinking one big deck could remove an entire air group from a campaign. At the same time, attackers learned that American carrier defenses were improving quickly. Better fighter direction, more experienced crews, and stronger anti-aircraft guns made each attack more costly. The Lexington class was powerful but transitional, a bridge between experimentation and the refined wartime carrier designs that followed. The class also taught the Navy about the limits of size alone.
A big deck could carry aircraft and absorb operational strain, but size did not automatically solve fire protection, underwater defense, or aircraft handling problems. Those lessons mattered as designers moved toward the Yorktown and Essex classes. The next generations would not simply copy Lexington and Saratoga. They would refine the parts that worked and correct the parts that combat exposed. There were only 2 ships in the class, so their evolution came through equipment, aircraft, and procedures, rather than many subclasses. Early air groups with biplanes gave way to modern monoplanes, fighters with enclosed cockpits, dive bombers able to attack steeply, and torpedo planes carrying heavy weapons over long distances. The mix changed as the Navy learned what worked against enemy fleets, land targets, and submarines.
Radar arrays, antennas, communications gear, and anti-aircraft batteries also changed as the war advanced. Older guns gave way to faster automatic weapons with better fire control. The original 8-inch guns lost their purpose as aircraft became both the main threat and the main weapon. Inside the ships, ready rooms, communication practices, and damage control procedures evolved from combat experience. Saratoga, surviving longer, saw more of these changes and helped shape the tactics that later carriers used.
The legacy of the Lexington class is much larger than the number of ships suggests. They proved that big, fast carriers could serve as the core striking arm of a fleet, not merely as scouts for battleships. Lessons from their design and combat record influenced the Yorktown and Essex classes, from hull size and hangar arrangements to radar integration, deck cycles, and coordinated airstrikes. Saratoga's survival into later war years added another layer to the legacy. She served in combat, training, reinforcement, and experimental roles, showing how a large carrier could adapt as doctrine changed. Her continued service helped bridge the gap between the early carrier battles and the more mature fast carrier operations that followed across the Pacific. Their physical presence is mostly gone. Lexington rests on the seabed, and Saratoga sank after post-war nuclear tests. Surveys and dives have documented their remains, while the name Lexington lives on in a later carrier preserved as a museum ship in Texas. Photographs, film, and archival records keep the earlier ships visible, but their true legacy lies with the sailors and aviators who turned the carrier from an experiment into the centerpiece of modern naval warfare.